Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this ongoing conversation. And here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to today's edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. And those last three words are very significant because most people who consider the Constitution look at the issue of rights in the Bill of Rights, and they basically ignore the sense of responsibility that are so necessary, that is so necessary to make sure that our republic remains just that. And I think, I'm thinking of Franklin's comment in 1787 upon leaving the convention hall, where he made a comment to a passerby about what had happened and, what did you end up giving us? And he said, a republic if you can keep it. And so I think that there is an element of responsibility on the part of citizens. And to be very honest with you, I think that in part is one of the issues that really needs to be reinvigorated in our society today. We welcome you to today's program. It is an absolutely gorgeous day, and this is the most beautiful time of the year. And it is beautiful. You look up today at that blue sky, and it's hard to believe that the sky can be that blue and that deep with all the things we hear about pollution and all the rest of it. It is so absolutely gorgeous outside. But we are here, and we are here for the attention and addressing issues related to the constitutional Republic of the United States, and it is a pleasure to have you. I would really encourage you to participate actively in our program. We have a phone number, and I'll give you my email address as well, and I want to begin there, actually. But our phone number is area code 304-658-3333, 304-658-3333. My email address is WAObrien, OBRIEN 906, all one word, no punctuation, WAObrien906 @gmail.com. And I mentioned the email address because I received three emails related to yesterday's program, all from the same person. And he was apparently following yesterday's program on an iPod and asked a couple of questions at the early on in the program, which he claims were answered at the end. I'm not sure that they really were, but first of all I want Jack to know how much I appreciate the emails, and I did send him a response which was kind of what I thought we would be beginning to today's edition of the Virtual Center, based on a continuation of the thinking that we were into yesterday. But I want to encourage you. Jack made the point that he enjoys listening. He's not a caller, and I can understand that, and I appreciate that very much, and I appreciate those of you who are out there who indeed do that. But as I told Jack, and I don't want him to think that I just did this as kind of an off the top way or offhanded way to bring an email to a conclusion. I really mean it. It really is a very important thing for me to know that you're out there, and I appreciated the email, and I told him that, and he said, I just want you to know I'm listening, and I'm getting a lot out of it and all that, and I don't need to know that, but I do, that's why I really solicit the calls as hard as I do. It's not that I don't believe that the information or the material is important or anything else. I do. But it really is reinforcing to me to know that there are people out there and that indeed this stuff is having an impact. It's what drives me. It's what keeps me going. And when you go day after day and you don't hear from anybody you begin to wonder whether, in fact, you could just do this in front of a mirror with no microphone or anything else and accomplish the same thing. So I appreciate the email very much. And I'm going to share some of the comments that Jack made from yesterday's program, because it's a good way to follow up yesterday's program and bring it to a what I believe is a logical conclusion. And I do have to say that, in fact, Jack's email, in part at least, is the inspiration for at least the first portion of today's program, and I want him to know that. It is something that I knew I had, and I thought, well, I might do this at some future point in time. But the question he raised suggests that it's an issue. It's the issue of free will related to Christianity, and it seems to me that the issue occurred to Jack, and it's an issue that needs to be addressed right now, and so I kind of made that decision based on his comment and his question, and I want him to know that, and I want him to know that I appreciate that. Anyway, Jack's comment yesterday was based not so much on the Mayflower Compact and the Dorchester Agreement, which were the first two documents we looked at, and we used those as examples of community, or as the Mayflower Compact says, the creation of a civil body politic, where those people that sign on the bottom line below it pledge to abide by the decisions and the rules and the acts and the ordinances and the constitutions and the officers appointed by the group as a whole. They basically commit themselves to obedience to rules which they themselves have participated in making, in passing, and laws or regulations or parameters for behavior, or whatever you want to call them. I think, as we talked yesterday, and I don't want to beat this to death necessarily, but in order to understand some of the principles that were revealed or elaborated upon in the documents we looked at yesterday, the first one, which is key, is the idea of consent of the governed. The whole idea being, and this is kind of a driving force in our whole political system, is the idea that the legitimacy of laws in our society, in our republic, is based on the idea of the consent of the governed. People can only be held responsible for obeying or responsible for disobeying rules and regulations which they have a part in making. If you participate, if you consent to abide by a particular set of rules and regulations, and then you violate those laws and regulations, then reason, common sense would tell you that you have every expectation of being punished for that crime. And I think that's legitimate. It's a key principle of our political system, and it's something that we all need to understand and appreciate. And connected to that, besides the idea of consent of the governed, is the idea of participation. The idea of participatory democracy is the phrase we used. The idea that legitimacy is achieved based on the principle of participation. And we know in our modern political conversation, we know that the very word democratic in our day-to-day existence, in our day-to-day language, is measured principally by the degree to which people are allowed to or denied the opportunity to participate in the rules and regulations which govern society. In other words, our society is said to be more democratic because we encourage or increase participation. We allow certain groups of people to participate by voting and running for office and all the rest of it, participating in our political campaigns, that were heretofore denied that opportunity. African-American men, for example, women, voters, under 21 years of age, as the years have gone on, as the generations have gone on, our system has become more open, and we have permitted larger and larger groups of people to participate in our political process. Consequently, people can say, legitimately so, that our society has progressively become more democratic as we've gone, and the way we measure that is that we have increased participatory opportunities, the degree of participation in our society. So what I'm suggesting is the level of degree of participation itself is the way we measure our democracy. And again, it is very important. And of course, there are all sorts of debates about the extent to which democracy involves choice. And then you get down to the question, does the mere opportunity to pick from a menu constitute democracy, or does democracy require something more substantive than that? Does democracy require some ability to participate in the choices themselves rather than just which choice you choose? In other words, it's quite different to be presented a menu of 3, 4, or 5 options and be allowed to pick one, as opposed to the opportunity to pick from 3, 4, or 5 options with a 6th option there that you can recommend if there's one there that you feel ought to be there that is not offered. And so the mere fact that you can participate in the choices available, it seems to me, is a way to to create much more substance and much more meaning to the level of your democracy. But there's absolutely no question that many people define freedom as the idea of having free choice, having some choice. But again, the question is that in and of itself freedom, or does freedom involve some right to participate in the determination of the choices available? And I think that's a discussion that continues to go on. It's a discussion that I'm sure we'll be back to over and over again. So it seems to me the documents we looked at yesterday revealed not only the issue of consent to the governed and the issue of participation, but also, and this is especially pertains to the Dorchester Agreement document, where you'll remember that there was a regular meeting of the entire community. At the banging of a drum before 8 o'clock on Monday morning, all the participants in the community would assemble in the meeting house. And there they would make rules and regulations that they would all agree to live by until the group reassembled. But in the interim, they would choose 12 people to run things between the full meetings, between the times that the full community would get together. And so what we see happening here is the issue of representation, the idea of representative government, rather than the idea of direct democracy. Direct democracy is, from Athenian democracy, is when all the citizens come together and make the rules and operate around the principle of majority rule. But the idea of representative democracy is based on the idea that it is inconvenient for people to spend all of their waking moments sitting in an assembly with their peers making rules. At some point in time, they have to go earn a living, support families and all the rest of it. And so what they do is they appoint people to represent them. And theoretically, the people that they would appoint would be people, they believe, who would vote the way they would vote if they were there. I mean, that's the ideal. That's what you look for in a representative, is somebody that seems to reflect your values and your priorities and your sense of justice and all the rest of it. A person whose voting record would pretty much mirror yours if you were the one sitting there. But the issue that the document revealed is the issue of representation is very important, because there are two kinds of representation. Edmund Burke, the conservative philosopher in Great Britain, spoke very eloquently about the differences between an elected representative who follows the will of those who elect him versus a representative who assumes the authority to make independent decisions based on the votes that he gets from his constituents. In other words, in the first case, people cast their votes for a representative, but they maintain the right to make decisions. The person that they elect as a representative is merely their agent. I tell you what to do and you go do it because I can't be there. So in a sense, you as the voter, as the citizen, you retain the power to make decisions. The representative does not have any independent power. The representative's job is to merely follow your will as you define it. Edmund Burke makes the statement that that approach to democracy can't work. And his argument is that in voting for a representative, we must be willing to give the representative the rights to make decisions in our name. So in a sense, the power passes from the voter to the elected representative, and the elected representative becomes the independent decision maker. So it's very obvious in the Dorchester Agreement, which we looked at yesterday, the Dorchester Agreement of 1633 in Dorchester, Massachusetts, that while the community chose 12 people to represent them in the interim, the fact of the matter is that the entire group was to reassemble at least once a month, at which point, presumably, they would have an opportunity to render judgment on the extent to which the chosen 12, the elected representatives, carried out the will of the community or the extent to which they did not. And theoretically, one would assume that they would either retain the 12 if they did indeed abide by the will of the whole, or replace the 12 if they did not, or whichever ones didn't. So in theory, the mere fact that the entire community reassembles as a whole, legislative and representative legislative government, legislatures around the world, they call it the Committee of the Whole, where the entire group meets as one body, as a committee of the whole. And the fact that that happens periodically means that they can hold the representatives accountable, which in turn means that the representatives do not become independent decision makers, but merely serve as agents of the community at large. That's very, very significant. And as we mentioned yesterday, and we've mentioned before, there's absolutely no question that the shift from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution of the United States is based principally on that shift in the nature of representation. Excuse me. That's what Madison meant when he talked about enlarging the sphere in Federalist Number 10. By creating a larger constituency, you take in more factions and you make it less likely that there will be a majority faction. And if there is not a majority faction making decisions for the group, then there are a series of minority factions vying for that right. And the fact that there is no majority to make decisions means, in theory, that the minority makes them. The best people make them. And that's what Madison would call, John Adams defined it as the natural aristocracy, the best people. So by enlarging the sphere, you guarantee that only the best known people are going to be elected. And they're going to become independent decision makers because the enlarged sphere, the larger constituency, makes it impossible for there to be a majority faction which would have power. And since there is no majority faction, but rather a series of minority factions, then the representatives themselves become independent decision makers. And power shifts from the electorate to the elected representatives. And that's a major key. And it's revealed right here in the Dorchester Agreement. And as I mentioned yesterday, you could do nothing but use the Dorchester Agreement and the Mayflower Compact, and you could teach half of the most American government classes in a way which most students could understand perfectly well. Because once you get into these documents and you read them and you understand the situations that exist there, then all of these concepts, all these theories and ideologies become very clear and very meaningful. It becomes easy to wrap your arms around them. And then finally, the last document that we looked at was John Winthrop's City on a Hill document. And we spent the last half hour of our time together yesterday on this document. And that's the point at which I closed the program with the idea of separation of church and state as being, a viable alternative in a pluralistic or in a diverse society. The one ingredient that is critical in understanding Winthrop and the Dorchester Agreement and the Mayflower Compact, all three of them, is that in order to have these concepts work, you have to have a working community, what the Mayflower Compact refers to as a civil body politic. There needs to be a common set of rules and principles and rights and wrongs that everybody agrees to. And there's no question that if everybody is in the same church, if everybody worships God in the same way, if everybody understands the relationship between man and God and the community at large in the same way, then the chances are that you have a much better chance at achieving consensus, unanimous agreement among your membership. And when there is unanimous agreement, creating a civil body politic and getting everybody to sign on and agree to submit to the rules and regulations of the community at large becomes much easier, because there is consensus, because there is not major disagreement within your community on anything. And so religion becomes the glue that makes this whole thing possible, that makes these communities possible. So when we, in our textbooks, when people talk all the time about America was settled for purposes of religious freedom and to create God-fearing communities and all the rest of it, it is very, very important that we understand the degree to which that's true and the degree to which it's not. These are independent constituencies, independent communities that exist as communities because they are all one church and they all agree on the major principles around which a society functions. So as a religious group, they can make political laws that all can live with and all can agree to. In other words, it becomes very difficult to separate the civil from the religious. They're all one and they're all mixed together in what the political scientists refer to as a theocracy. In that sense, then, you can say that each of these communities is a theocracy in the making. That's what these people are out to do, is create a set of civil laws which mirror God's religious laws. But they demand religious unanimity in order for that to work. And so there's no room here for dissent. There's no room for anything like free speech. There's no recognition of the idea of a minority and a majority. All there is unanimity. And if you don't like it, you leave. And we've heard this numerous times. I'm thinking of the Vietnam experience, and I've heard it on conservative traditional talk radio, terrestrial talk radio, about America, love it or leave it, and all this stuff. And the assumption is that America is based on a series of principles and ideals, and if you don't like it, leave it. That's true to a point. But when you lost the consensus, when you lost the ability to achieve unanimity, consensus, there's no concept of the idea of majority rights and minority rights. If you believe that the rules you make mirror the laws of God, then there's no room for anything like a minority point of view. There's only one. There is the right and nothing else. And so if you as an individual disagree with the rules of your community, then your option is to leave. And if you choose not to leave, then you will be punished. You will be executed. You'll be hung, whatever. And so Roger Williams is banished from the colony of Massachusetts Bay. So also is Ann Hutchinson. Many of the founders, and because when we study colonial history, and of course there was a time when we used to do that, but we've now reached the point where the idea is the colonial history is just all pre-independence stuff, so it's not important. I think these documents indicate to you that the colonial period is very important. But many of you will remember that many of the colonies, the original 13 colonies, are spin-offs of the original colony. For example, one church group led by John Davenport takes his entire congregation north from Massachusetts and sets up camp in what becomes the colony of New Hampshire. And another group from Boston, actually, the Boston Church, one of the pastors in Boston is Thomas Hooker. As Thomas Hooker takes his entire congregation south and west into what is now Connecticut, and Hooker becomes the founding father for the state, for the colony of Connecticut. He sets up camp around New Haven, Connecticut. And then, of course, there's Rhode Island, and Roger Williams and Ann Hutchinson are instrumental in the establishment of the Rhode Island community. And what all of these are the result of are groups of people or ministers who took their entire congregation off into the wilderness so they could set it up exactly the way they wanted it to be. It's entirely likely that the Hookers and the Davenports, probably there were things that they disagreed with, but not enough to rebel or anything like that. Just the idea, we'd be better off if we'd left. And so what we're seeing is the beginning of diversity within the Protestant establishment, within the Puritan or congregational establishment. And as long as the continent is pretty well unpopulated, I mean, you take care of the Indians, they don't count. And so ultimately you can move to Rhode Island, or you can move to New Hampshire, you can move to Connecticut, you can move into western Massachusetts, and there's plenty of room. You can set it up the way you want. And so every one of these is a moving, functioning, living organism called a community. And that's what John Winthrop does in his City Upon a Hill speech on the Arbella. He talks about the ingredients of community. And he does it better than I've ever seen anybody else do it. And he said basically that we must be knit together in this work as one man. The community functions as if it were one living organism. We must entertain each other in brotherly affection. We all know the relationship, the ideal relationship that brother has with brother. John Winthrop is suggesting that a true godly community is one in which people relate to each other the way brothers relate. Genuine love, genuine affection, genuine trust. In class this morning, I have a class of mostly freshmen, and I raised the question to try to get, because basically one of the things that is really difficult for especially college freshmen to understand is the concept of community. And of course the reason is understandable. They've grown up in a society where community is bashed. I mean, all we get is individual freedom and the right to protect our property and the right to do with my property what I want, and my rights as an individual under the Bill of Rights and the Supreme Court, I'll take it to court, and all of these other things. And it's constantly self-interest. Rarely do we focus on the public interest. In fact, we've made the very word community, the idea of communism, one of the most unpopular words in the English language. So the reality is that nobody growing up could possibly have a real understanding conceptually of the meaning of true community as Winthrop is explaining it here. So the question I asked these freshmen this morning, and I said, you don't have to answer this, but I do want you to reflect for 10 or 15 seconds on it. Think about all the people that you know, your friends. people that you know well, people you go to school with, people you work with, or whatever. Relatives, aunts, uncles, cousins, whatever. Think through all the people that you know best. And then think for a minute and say, how many real, true friends do I have? Think about the expression we hear all the time, I've got your back. How many people really have yours? How many people do you know that you absolutely, without doubt, not one question in your mind, would be there if you needed them? You could call them at 3 o'clock in the morning. You could walk in on them without calling ahead. People that you truly trusted and know that love you so much that they would do anything to make sure that you didn't suffer or you weren't in pain or you weren't being hurt or whatever, because they care so much for you that if you hurt, they would hurt. And if you are experiencing joy, then they experience joy. How many people do you know that would fit that bill? Chances are, not that many. Remember several weeks ago here on the Virtual Center, we looked at Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. The ideal Gemeinschaft is community, and the ideal Gesellschaft is what we think of when we talk about society. Winthrop is defining the ideal Gemeinschaft. And the glue that holds it together is the common worship of God. And what I did this morning with freshmen is ask them to think about how many true friends they have, and then to reflect on the fact. And this is usually kind of disturbing to people, because you can sit there, and I was looking at their faces, and you can see it working. And say, all right, now let's, for a minute, never mind the people that really have your back, the true friends and stuff. Let's think about the acquaintances you have, people you work with and go to school with, and neighbors and friends and all the rest of it. How many people do you know that that they are your friends? That you get along. We socialize together. We work together. We do a lot of things. But in your own private moments, when you're by yourself, you always say, "There's something about that person that I don't trust or I don't like." I always have the sneaking suspicion that that person has his own or her own agenda. They're always looking out for themselves. They're people that warm up to other people because they see that it might benefit them in the long run. They look at a neighborhood and they decide they want their children to go to a particular elementary school, primarily because the children in that neighborhood are the children of lawyers and doctors and the rest of it, and I want my kid to grow up socializing with the children of prominent, successful people. Or I want my kid to go to such and such a private school or to such and such a college or university because of the networking opportunities that are going to be available there. Fact of the matter is, how much of the interpersonal relationship that exists in today's world are based on self-interest? I want to do this. I want to help in this organization or this cause because it will look good on my resume, because it'll help me get into college, or it'll help me look good in competition for jobs. And the result of that is that as you think about it, you never really know who your real friends are. You never really know how many people are playing a role and how many genuine friendships you really have. In other words, society is becoming more and more like Gesellschaft, even though you long for Gemeinschaft. Winthrop is defining Gemeinschaft. And Winthrop is saying we must be knit together in this work as one man. We must entertain each other in brotherly affection. We must be willing to abridge ourselves of our superfluities for the supply of others' necessities. In other words, we have to be willing to give up what we don't really need in order that those things can go to people who really do need. not because we get a tax write-off, but because it's the right thing to do, because you genuinely love these people and you care for them and worry about them. We must uphold a familiar commerce together in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality. We must delight in each other, make others' conditions our own, rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together, always having before our eyes our commission and community in the work. Our community is members of the same body, so shall we keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. And if we do that, the Lord will be our God and delight to dwell among us as his own people, and will command a blessing upon us in all our ways, so that we shall see much more of his wisdom, power, goodness, and truth than formerly we have been acquainted with. If we do this, this is the commission, this is the covenant. When John Winthrop talks about we need to do this and keep our commission and our community in mind. Your commission is your charge, your duty, your mission. And so the implication here is that this perfect community that we are set up, mirrored on the laws of God, is part of something bigger. We have a mission. We have a job to do. And our job is to create what Winthrop called a city upon a hill. Our job is to create a community of God that is so perfect and so in tune with God's plan that the entire world will reform itself by our example. We will become reformers of the world because that's our mission. God wants us. God chose us in covenant, made a covenant, gave us a commission, and said, if you do this, all the world will reform itself by your example. We will be, Winthrop says, as a city upon a hill. All the eyes of mankind will be upon us. And everybody in the future that creates a community will say, oh God, please let it be like they did it in New England. So these people consider themselves to be reformers. They are no different than the Crusaders fighting under the banner of the Pope in the Middle Ages. They are reformers who are setting out to reform the world by their own example, by setting up the city upon a hill. The implication, however, is that a covenant or a commission is a contract. It comes with obligations and responsibilities. And Winthrop says all of these good things will happen to us. God will walk among us and dwell among us, and we shall find that the God of Israel is among us, to the point that 10 of us will be able to resist 1,000 of our enemies. There'll be no stopping us. We will be invincible because we will be following God's plan to the letter, and God will be among us, and he will be inspiring us, and he will be supporting us, and our community will flourish. We will have bumper crops. We will have peace. We will have healthy, beautiful, wonderful, God-fearing children. In other words, we will have heaven on earth. This is the city upon a hill. This is what these people claim to the mother country that they are doing. We are not radicals who have left the Church of England, who have abandoned it. We remain reformers of the Church of England who seek to reform it from afar by our example. And of course the key to that is, if the people in England, including the king, don't believe that, then they will lose their charter, they will lose their freedom. And they can't lose their charter, because literally their charter is ultimately the commission from God that they feel that they have. So they can't risk losing the charter, because that would deny them the freedom that they need in order to carry out God's plan. So this is their mission, to reform the world. And the point that I made at the end of the program yesterday, and I needed to revisit it because you can't leave it with just a reference, just a mention, is this idea of American exceptionalism. Those people today who continue to argue that America is a nation commissioned by God to reform the world by its example. Many people still believe that that's what the United States of America is about today. We're beginning to pick it up now in the debates over Syria about whether President Obama's determination to strike Syria based on the Syrian government's use of gas to gas its own people, which is considered to be inhuman. So the United States is assuming the role of enforcer for mankind. I saw a quote in this morning's press somewhere which made the reference that President Obama made the point when asked about the red line that he drew. Remember, he drew the red line on Syria a number of years ago. If the Syrian government uses gas against its own people, chemical warfare, that would be like a red line. That would be crossing the red line. And this morning when asked about that, President Obama made the point and say, this is not my red line. This is not America's red line. This is mankind's red line. In other words, the United States is assuming the mantle of God's army in the enforcement of God's will in Syria because of the use of chemical warfare, which since World War I, the civilized world has defined as a place we would never go again. And President Obama is saying if Assad's government went there, then the world needs to respond. And we will respond because we are the agents of God in the world. And this feeds on this idea of American exceptionalism, that we have been commissioned by God to somehow enforce God's will in the world and reform the world in our own example. And they go to John Winthrop's City Upon a Hill speech to do it. The only difference is they don't read the speech. They read the title about City on a Hill, and they say, that's us. We are the City on a Hill. We're exceptional. And then they look at the Ten Commandments, and they say America's emphasis on individualism and individual freedom and private property is very consistent with the idea of the Ten Commandments. Therefore, this is the idea that America is a Christian nation, etc., and on it goes. And it kind of feeds itself. But it's all based on the common principle of community. And it's all based on the idea that in the community that John Winthrop is talking about, there is no minority, there is no dissent, there is nothing remotely resembling what we call today a loyal opposition. You are not, in John Winthrop's world, you do not have the power, I was going to say you are not empowered, to respectfully disagree with God. There's no disagreement with God. If this is God's plan, then that's the only plan there is. And to disagree with it is to leave, be banished, or be executed. Because you cannot argue with God. So Winthrop's commission, or Winthrop's message to the Puritan citizens on the Arbella is that we are here to perform God's commission, to do God's will. As Perry Miller said in one of his books on this particular issue, Winthrop argues that these people are on an errand into the wilderness. That's a beautiful title because it really says it all. An errand into the wilderness. To set up God's ideal community and thereby reform the world. But a commission or a covenant is a contract. And a contract, by definition, includes language on what will happen if you live by the contract, but it also includes language about what will happen if you do not live by the contract. And Wilson, and Winthrop goes on and says, after he mentions the city on a hill, the eyes of all people are upon us. And then he said, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world. We shall open the mouths of enemies to speak evil of the ways of God, and all professors of God's sake. In other words, if we do not subscribe to the commission, if we violate the covenant, if we don't live up to God's terms in the covenant, we shall shame the faces of many of God's worthy servants, and cause their prayers to be turned into curses upon us, till we be consumed out of the good land whither we are going. And then he quotes Moses in Deuteronomy to conclude his discourse, or as he says, to shut up this discourse, with the exhortation of Moses. Beloved, there is now set before us life and good, death and evil, in that we are commanded this day to love the Lord our God, and to love one another, to walk in his ways, and to keep his commandments and his ordinance and his laws, and the articles of our covenant with him, that we may live and be multiplied, and that the Lord our God may bless us in the land whither we go to possess it. But if our hearts shall turn away so that we will not obey, but shall be seduced and worship other gods, our pleasures and profits, and serve them, it is propounded unto us this day, we shall surely perish out of the good land, whether we pass over this vast sea to possess it. If we don't abide by the covenant, God will withdraw his support from us, and we will punish, and we will perish. And it is, I think, very revealing that Winthrop identifies our pleasures and our profits as the most visible way that we can turn our backs on the covenant we have with Almighty God. Profit is sin. Self-interest at the expense of the public interest. The public interest is God's interest. It is all based on community. It is all based on the fact that we are knit together as one man, and we function as one living organism. I mentioned at the outset of the hour Jack's email, and the point that he made about all of this was the fact that there doesn't seem to be, even though this is God's covenant, there doesn't seem to be an active participatory God in the whole thing. In other words, these people seem, not just Winthrop, but the Dorchester Agreement and the Mayflower Compact as well, all three of these documents, the people in them seem to believe that they are within their rights to operate independently and freely. They are not waiting for God to come in and make the rules. In other words, they are basically saying, we know what God wants, and God has given us the freedom to either do it or not do it. And so Jack's sense was that there's an element of separation of church and state even in these documents, because there's a distance between man and God that seems to be revealed in every one of these documents. Tell me. I know that Jack will be probably listening on iPod at a future time, but I want you all to appreciate the depth of what Jack has said in that email. So perceptive, so insightful. His point is that separation of church and state seems to be almost an obvious, inherent part of this whole thing. And I basically mentioned that that's where I wanted to go today, at least in the first part of the program. And at the close of the program yesterday, I talked about separation of church and state for obvious reasons. The only way that you can have the civil body politic, the only way that you can have the consensus that Winthrop is talking about, that the Dorchester Agreement is talking about, that the Mayflower Compact is talking about, is to have the religious consensus. Religion is the glue that holds this all together, makes it all work. As long as you have unanimous agreement that what you are doing as a community in passing laws is really putting on paper God's laws. If you are getting your marching orders from Scripture and man is making laws that are copies of or direct outcomes of God's rules and God's laws, then it becomes much easier to demand enforcement, to demand obedience. It becomes much less likely that there will be dissent. It becomes clearly unlikely that there will be a minority opinion. And some of you will remember, who have read on this period, Ann Hutchinson's sin was at the close of sermons on Sunday, Ann Hutchinson would invite people back to her home, and she would expand on the sermons of the day. And these people would discuss the sermons without the pastor or the person who delivered the sermon being there. And many of the people in these discussions would raise questions. And in other words, what was happening is that the sermon was becoming the basis for free thinking and discussion and disagreement as well as agreement. The sermon was not being seen. Ann Hutchinson was not looking at the sermon as the final word on the subject around which the community should rally together and support. Rather, the sermon was the basis for discussion and disagreement and dissent. There's no way in the world that this community could accept that. So they arrest Ann Hutchinson and they try her before the general court and before Governor Winthrop himself. And when she begins to admit that she has visions and she personally speaks with God, and that she is more in tune with God than is the minister and his sermon, then the general court is left with no option except to banish her. Because she literally threatens the security and the unity of the community. She is an example of something that there's no room for in Puritan Massachusetts, and that's dissent or disagreement or free thinking. And therefore she has to leave. And the stories of the Puritans hanging Quakers and banishing Roger Williams, because Williams believed that church and state should be separated primarily because state was corrupt and it would corrupt the Word of God. The only way to maintain the purity of the Word of God, Roger Williams said, was to separate it from government. Because government would make the pure impure. No way in the world did this community condone separation of church and state, because in their minds it was all part of the same plan because of the mission. And to allow a church or a congregation to have a dissenting opinion and listen to dissenting opinions from the truth as they defined it was heresy, and they could not condone it. I would suggest to you then that if you are a subscriber to the idea of American exceptionalism in today's parlance, in today's conversation, then there were certain things that you have to answer for. And one of the major things is the lack of religious cohesion in our society. In the fact that there are a number of different positions and attitudes towards God and towards the world that exist freely and independently in our society. We even respect in our society those people that don't believe in God at all. With that kind of a diverse, contradictory message in the area of religion, how in the name of heaven can you claim that you are reforming the world in that image? There's no message. It seems to me that you are confronted with the need to rationalize that and justify that. Not only that, but the basic principles of our political republic, the idea of free speech and free press, the idea of separation of church and state, the idea of a right to trial by jury, the idea of dissent, the idea of a loyal opposition, the idea of the acceptance of the relevance of a majority opinion and minority opinions, the idea that the way you achieve truth is to have a clash of ideas in the marketplace of ideas. All of these values, all of these things that we stand for are inconsistent with the community that the Puritans, that John Winthrop was defining in the colony of Massachusetts. They were on a mission to reform the world in God's image, according to God's plan. There was no dissent, no agreement, no free speech, nothing like that in Winthrop. To take that out of context and apply it to George Bush's decision to bomb Iraq in March of 2003 is an absolute disgrace. I'm struck here by Abraham Lincoln's very famous comment about man and God, about this nation and God. My concern, he says, is not whether God would support what we're doing. My concern is to make sure that we are supporting what God would do. And I would suggest to you that there's a big difference between the two. So to set out, we've been talking over and over here at the Virtual Center about the idea of appropriating the founders and taking the ideas of the founders and cherry-picking them and applying them to contexts and to situations that they didn't belong in order to reinforce positions that we're comfortable with. But those who would claim American exceptionalism in the same context are cherry-picking the word and the words of God in the same vein. It is one thing to cherry-pick and try to appropriate the founders and enlisting them in your political crusade for a particular ideology or economic theory or whatever it is you're talking about. I prefer to think of, when I think of Tea Party, I still enjoy Alice's Tea Party in Wonderland. I'm perfectly willing to go along with that one, but I haven't quite accepted this new one yet. What I'm suggesting then is that we really need to read the history and take the history seriously. We have to base our positions and our ideas and what we know to be knowledge, what we believe to be truth, based on an honest, impassionate, dispassionate reading of the sources, and basically try to take our marching orders from the past. If we are going to claim the framers as our own, then we have got to be willing to look at and deal with the framers in their own terms and take honestly and sincerely what they meant in the context of when they wrote and what they said. We are not free to do as Cleon Skousen did and cherry pick from here and there and find these quotes to support things that you believe ought to be the principles on which this government is built. We can't have that. we can't allow our children to continue to be exposed to this stuff. And the only ammunition, the only weapon that we've got is to educate our children in what these concepts are about and what they mean, to the point that nobody is going to be able to dissuade them or confuse them or lead them along an artificial or the wrong path. Education is the solution to this. Education is the way we can combat this. Education is the tool we must develop and we must use. I guess that's really what the Virtual Center is all about. It is the top of the hour. We have reached 3 p.m. here in the East. I neglected to mention at the outset that we were running 2 hours early today, but this is in order to accommodate my schedule. But those who are picking it up on archives or on iPods or whatever will not worry about that difference. But those of you listening live, obviously must pay attention to the start times. But we are at the end of our first hour. We'll pause and take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and we'll have our second hour of today at the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I'm Bill O'Brien. Please stay with us. We'll be right back. This is Bill O'Brien. We're back for yet another hour here at the Virtual Center. I am so happy to be with you, and I thank you for being with us. If you're just joining us, welcome to today's program. If you've been with us through the first hour, then we kind of went back through the documents we looked at yesterday during our first hour and revisited Winthrop and Winthrop City upon a Hill idea, looking specifically at it from the perspective of American exceptionalism, or those who claim the ideas of American exceptionalism that are being used today to support a particular economic system or political system, or to justify wars or interventions or shock and awe exercises or whatever you want to call it. And I think it's very, very important to be aware of what we're dealing with here historically and what we're not. And to take these things out of context and use them in a totally different context, it seems to me, is at best inaccurate and at worst dishonest. Our phone number, love to hear from you, and now would be a perfect time because we've kind of reached a breaking point here. Our phone number is area code 304-658-3333. If you call that number, you'll be into our studios and we'll get you on the air as quickly as we can. That's area code 304-658-3333. My personal email address, and we've been talking today about an email that kind of spurred this today a little bit, from Jack in Shreveport, who emailed 2 or 3 times between yesterday's program and today's. The email address, my email address, is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906, no punctuation, @gmail.com. We've been talking about the idea of covenant. We've been talking about the idea of the Puritans believing that they are God's chosen people. We've been talking about the idea of participatory democracy. We've been talking about the idea, the principle of consent to the governed. We've been talking about the idea of the proper role, of the proper definition of representation in our representative republic, the extent to which the elected representative is the decision maker or merely the agent of those who elect him. In other words, we've been talking about the issues, what would be necessary in order to shift power from the people who initially have it to the representatives who are expected to exercise it. And I think that's significant. In other words, we've been touching on many of the principles of our American political system. But I would suggest to you that there are certain things that we include in our treatment of the American political system which are not included. And I hope that I was clear on those, because I think they are very important. There's no idea here of minority and majority rights. There's no recognition of something called a loyal opposition. There's no sense here of the ideas of of loyal dissent or disagreement or a minority position or I respectfully disagree or any of that. As long as you can claim that what you are doing is carrying out God's plan and God's, enacting laws that are consistent with God's guidance, then to object to them is to object to God himself. So there is no room for minority. There's no room for dissent. None of those things that we take for granted in our contemporary, in the American Republic today, the idea of free speech, the idea of differing opinions, the idea of the marketplace of ideas, the idea of the competition of free ideas, all of these things, no room for here. None of them fit. And so I would suggest to you that if you are arguing for the idea of America's mission to reform the world in its image and its example, then you must somehow recognize that the world you are trying to create is the image of what we are, not what John Winthrop thought we were. And so to take his term about the city on a hill and transpose it from 1630 up into 2013 and claim that the guiding principle in the decision as to whether we should strike Syria or not, I would suggest to you is one huge stretch. And I think we have to be careful doing that. To go back to Jack's email and his mention of the idea of separation of church and state, the point that I made at the conclusion of yesterday's program, and I think it's only just that we revisit it and that we address it here. All of this is contingent on the idea that this community is based upon the fact that everybody is of the same religion. As long as that holds true, Winthrop's program can work. But the minute you accept the idea that there are differences of opinion, the minute you accept the idea that not everybody sees God, worships God, and are in the same terms, when you create a colony, a society like William Penn did in Pennsylvania, where William Penn offered opportunities in Pennsylvania to anyone so long as they believed in God, you offered those who would come to Pennsylvania religious freedom in a world where religious freedom was very rare. These people coming to the New World were coming from a Europe where religious freedom did not exist, where people were persecuted and executed for their religious beliefs. It is very obvious that for William Penn to offer the lure or the attraction of religious freedom for coming and settling in Pennsylvania is going to bring people from all over Europe, from all over, many different religious denominations settle in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania becomes, in microcosm, what the United States of America becomes later on. A hodgepodge of different religions, different nationalities, different language groups, different sets of priorities, different ways of looking at the world. And the major challenge to community in governing America, the challenge to unity and community in governing Pennsylvania, is to take religion off the table by making it clear that the laws and the rules by which Pennsylvania will be governed have nothing to do with and are totally separate from what you believe in terms of religion. As long as you worship God, how you worship God is your business, William Penn is saying. And so, in reality, the challenge for the governance of Pennsylvania is to govern a society or a colony, a community, that is not comprised of only one religious group, where there is a sense of unity and agreement, but rather to govern a diverse situation where there is a multiplicity of opinions about God, about religion, about the world, about heaven, about hell, about all of these things. The only way that you can govern a community like that is to take religion out of the equation. You must separate church and state. Because the minute you put church on the table, you alienate not just somebody, most everybody. It's not a question of worshiping God. Who's God? If the rules are going to be written according to God, who's God? If taxes are going to be collected to support a church, whose church? Why should I pay to support a church that I don't subscribe to and then tithe in order to support my own church? Aren't I being double taxed? So the only way to govern in that kind of a situation is to take the most explosive, volatile issues, the issues that will divide rather than unite, off the table. And this is the message that I think history gives us in today's world. The founders would be absolutely astounded if they were able to witness our political campaigns, national or local, doesn't matter, that focus around things like right to life, euthanasia, and the right to intentionally allow people to let people die or help people die who are suffering incredibly from terminal illness. The idea of gay marriage. The idea of the right to bear arms, to have a gun. The things that divide people the most cannot be the ingredients of your political discussion. If they are, you can't govern. Because the minute you take a position on one side of these controversial issues, you alienate those who are on the other side. I'm struck, the son, the prince, and they're breaking hard-boiled eggs. They're breaking eggs. And the young prince slices his finger on a piece of the eggshell. And the king goes absolutely ballistic. This is all in Jonathan Swift. The king goes absolutely ballistic. And he issues an edict throughout the realm that from now on it will be a sin punishable by death to anyone who chooses or takes it upon himself to break his eggs at the wrong end. The idea that government is claiming the right to tell people which end of the egg they need to break. Now, if you read that, of course, if you read that as a child, you're not going to understand it in its full beauty. But it's the biggest put down that you could possibly have on the absurdity of government and the absurdity of rules and what we expect people to obey and accept. And the idea that there is a right way and a wrong way to break an egg. Or in another part of Gulliver's Travels, he happens upon a kingdom where there are two major parties vying for power, those that are called the low heels and the high heels. And those in one party are walking high heels, and those in the other party walking low heels. And they kill each other because of because they're high-heeled or low-heeled. And, of course, what Swift is doing is absolutely pointing out the absurdities of some of the reasons and some of the things that contemporary man chooses to kill each other over, fight wars over. The Sunnis and the Shiites, for example. The Christians and the Muslims. My God versus your God. The point is that in order to govern effectively, government must always work to create community. Government must work toward consensus. You're never going to get it because you don't have religion as an aid anymore. All of a sudden, religion now is a hindrance because there are so many different religions within your political constituency, within your community. So the only way to govern and to pursue community and consensus is to get religion off the table. So what these people are telling us, if we would only listen, is that if you want to govern effectively, you don't focus your political campaigns and your political discussions on the most controversial issues. Those are private issues. Government does not get involved in them because it's too disruptive of the community. Government must address the issues where it has a chance to pursue consensus. And if government is constantly focusing in those areas, then most of the time, most of your people are going to be pretty satisfied with most of what government does. And you have a sense of political camaraderie, a sense of community, a sense that we really are a civil body politic who can concentrate on the right things in the right places, like taking care of people, helping people that need help, make sure like health care, making people get a quality education, making sure that nobody's starving, you know, all of these things that are things that we can do. But instead of that, we channel government into areas that there's no way in the world we can reach agreement on. The most explosive issues. The best example of this is in American history is the Civil War. Of all the issues that had the potential literally to blow this nation apart, it was the issue of slavery. And when our political leaders began to take positions, political positions on the institution of slavery, they were inflaming the most volatile, the most potent issue that would divide society, and they were not taking it off the table, they were ensuring that it was on the table. And there was no question, given the compromise, the history of compromise that this nation needed to go through all through its history in order to hold this union together because of slavery, for political parties to start to run campaigns based on the issue of slavery. This nation environment, you're not going to have you're not going to have agreement. You're not going to have a chance of reaching consensus. You're not going to get people who can get along. You're liable to get a situation like we have in Washington right now, which is, for all practical purposes, total dysfunction, where they can't agree on anything. It seems to me that we have totally lost our way in terms of what history tells us. And we're doing it because people are putting their own self-interest ahead of the public interest. The public interest is not to come to blows within your community over the idea of right to life or abortion or gay marriage or any of these other explosive issues that nobody's going to agree upon. because everybody's got, they can basically grab scripture, they grab their Bibles, and they cite chapter and verse to prove that they're right. There's no way to argue that they're wrong. There's no way to convince them that they're wrong. You can't win, so don't do it. So, in a sense, the community based on religion that Winthrop and the Dorchester Agreement and the Mayflower Compact are talking about is an approach to community that has to change with the introduction of religious diversity in America. And Pennsylvania becomes the model because William Penn's number one priority, he is given a charter for the colony of Pennsylvania by the king, and his responsibility is to get people to that colony and make Pennsylvania productive, generate wealth. Because the way that Pennsylvania is governed is the way you have to govern when you're dealing with diversity rather than homogeneity. And so Winthrop's City Upon a Hill can only work in that situation. And to go back to Jack's point in his email about the lack of a visible role for God in these discussions, I think, and this is just me talking, I'm not taking issue with Jack at all, because I think his comment is very, very insightful and raises all sorts of possibilities. But I think what we're dealing with here probably is the issue of free choice. And, Christians, all Christian denominations believe in the idea that man is free to make a choice. Man is free to choose good or choose evil. Now, the Puritans the Congregationalists are among those who believe that because of the idea of original sin, man cannot choose good. He can only choose evil unless he is shown the way. And that's what the role of church and state and all the rest of it is to basically make the rules in order to lead man to the proper choices, to the choices that God wants him to make. But man is given free will, and given man's sin, the general assumption is that free will is going to lead man to choose evil over good, negative over positive, black over white, whatever you wanted to call it, self-interest over public interest. And when I read that email this morning, and this is what I meant when I said Jack has inspired a portion of, I think, of today's program, it dawned on me that John Winthrop himself addresses this issue several years later. In fact, in 1645. In 1645, John Winthrop, as governor, he's been governor now for 15 years in the colony of Massachusetts. John Winthrop is summoned before the General Court of Massachusetts. And the reason is because there is discord in Massachusetts. The harmony of 1630 is no longer there. And, if those who have studied colonial history in New England during this period will point out that the major danger to harmony and community in colonial Massachusetts is opportunity. There's so much land available. There's so much opportunity in the West. There, with growth and with the emergence of commerce and all the rest of it, there's so much potential for profit, for personal profit, that it becomes very difficult to continue to send John Winthrop's message of humility and meekness and putting aside your own wants and your own profits for the public good. It becomes harder and harder and harder to make that message stick as the years go by. And at one point in 1645, the court summons, the General Court, which is the legislature, summons the governor to appear before it and to answer questions about whether, in fact, he and his cabinet, his appointed officers, are disobeying or violating their covenant as leaders. These people, they believe, the religion teaches them that God not only not only operates by covenant with the whole community, but these people believe that every man, every person is called to do his life's work. That and many of you have heard this term before, that everyone's profession is a calling, and that man's job is to respond to God's calling. Some are called to be teachers, some are called to be carpenters, some are called to be to be shipbuilders, some are called to be governors, some are called to be elected representatives, some are called to be police officers, some are, whatever it happens to be. And the idea is that when you enter that profession, you have an obligation to be the best at it that you can be. That's your calling. That's God's covenant with you. It's the idea of decisions, and a speech has two parts to it. The first part is to respond to the allegations that he has violated his covenant with God, that he has violated the terms of the office to which he was called by God. And I'm just reading a portion of this because I want to get to the second part of this speech before we go off the air today, because I think it's very important. Winthrop says, in response to this, the great questions that have troubled this country are about the authority of the magistrates and the liberty of the people. So he's raising the question about the relationship between those who govern, and the people whom they are chosen to govern. And he said these are the great questions that have troubled this country. And then he talks generally to the legislature, to the general court, and he says, it is yourselves who have called us to this office. You called me to be governor. I didn't call you. I didn't run for it. You called me to it. It is yourselves who have called us to this office. And being called by you, we have our authority from God in way of an ordinance, such as hath the image of God eminently stamped upon it. The contempt and violation whereof hath been vindicated with examples of divine vengeance. That sentence says, we have been called by you to this office, but once we take office, we are no longer accountable to you. We are only accountable to God. Think about that. You have called us, and being called by you, we have our authority from God in way of an ordinance. That means that we are no longer accountable to you. We are accountable to God as we understand God. In other words, you can't tell us what to do because we get our marching orders from God, and what we hear God saying may not be what you hear God saying. So you have no option except to trust that we are fulfilling the Word of God. So what Winthrop is basically saying is the charges which cause you to summon us here today are bogus. You have no right to accuse us of violating our covenant with God, since you don't have any role or any right to know what our relationship with God is. You called us to the office, we get our authority from God. So once we're in, you can't get us out, is what Winthrop is suggesting. This is an absolutely incredible statement of separation of leaders of authority from the people who elected them. If I argue that I'm getting my marching orders from God, then you can't hold me accountable anymore. And that's what he's telling the general court. This is an absolutely incredible statement. I entreat you, he says, to consider that when you choose magistrates, you take them from among yourselves, men subject to like passions as you are. Therefore, when you see infirmities in us, you should reflect upon your own, and that would make you bear the more with us, and not be severe censurers of the failings of your magistrates, when you have continual experience of the like infirmities in yourselves and others. We're not professional government people. We're like you guys. So if you call us to fill this role, then we need on-the-job training. You can't expect us to be perfect, because we are taken from you. And then he says, we account him a good servant who breaks not his covenant. The covenant between you and us is the oath you have taken of us, which is to this purpose, that we shall govern you and judge your causes by the rules of God's laws. When you call one to be a magistrate, he says. Well, let me go back. He gives an example, and he said, when you agree with a workman to build you a ship or a house, he undertakes as well for his skill as for his faithfulness, for it is his profession, and you pay him for both. In other words, if you hire somebody to build a ship, it's because he's an expert shipbuilder. But when you call us to be government, you can't expect us to be experts in the field of government. When you call one to be a magistrate, he says, he doth not profess nor undertake to have sufficient skill for that office, nor can you furnish him with gifts. Therefore, you must run the hazard of his skill and his ability. Once you choose us, once you call us to fill this role, you're stuck with us, is what he's saying. You no longer have the right to judge us. That is an incredible statement by a governor to a legislature. And I think it's very, very revealing. And then he gets to the second part of his statement. And this is the part that gets all the attention. And this is the part we have to end today's program on. We have 20 minutes left in today's program. He said the other point that he wants to address, the other point concerning liberty, I observe a great mistake in the country about that. Remember, he said the two issues here are the power of the magistrates and the liberty of the people. He has addressed the power of the magistrates. You call us, but we get our marching orders from God, so you no longer can hold us accountable. The only covenant we've got with you is we'll do the best we can to follow God's plan, and you're stuck with us, is what Winthrop is saying. That's an incredible, incredible statement. Then he addresses the issue of the people's liberty. And he said, for the other point concerning liberty, I observe a great mistake in the country about that. And this is absolutely dynamite. He says there is a twofold liberty, natural, and then in parentheses he says, I mean as our nature is now corrupt, and civil or federal. There's two kinds of liberty, natural liberty and civil liberty or federal liberty. He says the first, natural liberty, is common to man with beasts and other creatures. By this, man, as he stands in relation to man simply, hath liberty to do what he lists. It is a liberty to evil as well as to good. This liberty is incompatible and inconsistent with authority and cannot endure the least restraint of the most just authority. The exercise and maintaining of this liberty makes men grow more evil and in time to be worse than brute beasts. Then he quotes in Latin, omnis summus licentia deterioris. I guess that translates into the greatest licentiousness always, that in other words, the more free you are, the more licentious we become, because we are all stained with original sin. So Winthrop is saying there's two kinds of liberty. There's natural liberty, which is the liberty to do whatever you want. And that's the same kind of liberty that man has along with beasts and other creatures. The liberty to do anything we want, the liberty to do evil as well as good. And he said this liberty is inconsistent and incompatible with authority and cannot endure the least restraint of the most just authority. The exercise and maintaining of this liberty makes men grow more evil and in time makes them worse than brute beasts. This is the great enemy of truth and peace, that wild beast which all of the ordinance of God are bent against, to restrain and subdue it. When we talk about liberty of the people, talking just and honest. You are free to obey the law. You are not free to disobey it. And what he is making here is a distinction. He is pointing out the limitations on individual freedom. I would suggest to you these are limitations which too many of today's spokesmen in the political arena are not aware of and do not condone and do not even pay heed to. There is too much in our world today where people arguing that because they are human and live in this country, they have the right to do any damn thing they want, whatever its outcome to everybody else. If I decide that I'm making a fortune and I decide that I don't want to take a portion of my wealth and return it to the community so it can be used for those in need, if I decide that I want to stash it in the Cayman Islands somewhere, I have the freedom to do that. Under the First Amendment, I'm free. And Winthrop is saying, damn it, no, you are not. He said there's two kinds of freedom. There's a right to do whatever you want. That's what the animals have. The beasts of the forest have those rights. That makes you an animal, not a human being. But then he said there's civil freedom or federal freedom. This is the right to do what you should do, but not the right to do what you shouldn't do. This is the kind of freedom that we have to go to the map for and discuss. This liberty is maintained in a way of subjection to authority. It's the same kind of liberty wherewith Christ has made us free. When God set us free, he didn't set us free to do anything we want. He set us free to live and function within a community organized around the kinds of rules and regulations that he dictated. It is kind of like the idea of freedom with responsibility or with limitations. If you are babysitting a 3-year-old toddler, you cannot open the front door and let that toddler go out into the streets of the cities with traffic and crime and all the rest of it. You cannot concede that you cannot give that child total freedom to do whatever he wants because he's not capable of handling it. But if you build a fence around your front yard, then you let that child out and be free because the fence becomes the limitations. And as long as you've made sure that there's nothing within the yard that can cause the child harm, then you can concede that child freedom because there are clear limitations what that child can and cannot do with that freedom. That's what we're talking about here. And he is equating it with man's liberty wherewith Christ made us free. Then he uses this example. The woman's own choice makes such a man her husband. Yet being so chosen, he is her Lord, and she is to be subject to him, yet in a way of liberty. And a true wife accounts her subjection her honor and freedom, and would not think her condition safe and free, but in her subjection to her husband's authority. What Winthrop is doing is defining freedom the way Christ would define it in the relationship between husband and wife. The wife is expected to be subject to the husband, but that doesn't mean she lives in bondage. It means that within the confines of her proper role as wife, she exercises and experiences and enjoys freedom. And it's the recognition from both sides as to what the rules are that is the basis of freedom. Such is the liberty of the church under the authority of Christ, her king and husband, is using the church and the suggestion that the authority of Christ in the church is the same as the power of king in the kingdom or husband in the family or in the home. His yoke, Christ's, is so easy and sweet to her as a bride's ornaments. The church is not free to do whatever it wants. The church is free only to preach and try to understand God's word. And that relationship is not bondage. It is freedom. And if through forwardness or want set her ashame, she is at no rest in it until she take it up again. And whether her Lord smiles upon her and embraceth her in his arms, or whether he frowns or rebukes or smites her, she apprehends the sweetness of his love in all, and is refreshed, supported, and instructed by every such dispensation of his authority over her. Of Christ within the church, and husband and within the home, or king and subject within the nation. Those analogies are very, very important to understand, because they are basically defining the limitations on individual freedom. And his basic premise, his basic position is, if you identify or define freedom as the right to do whatever you want, you will only do evil, because you're a sinner. So your liberty is a controlled liberty. It is the freedom to do that which is good, just, and honest only. That's why there are rules forbidding anything else. On the other side, he says, ye know who they are, plain of this yoke, and say, let us break their bands. We will not have this man to rule over us. Even so, brethren, it will be between you and your magistrates. If you want to stand for your natural corrupt liberties, and will do what is good in your own eyes, you will not endure the least weight of authority, but will murmur and oppose and be always striving to shake off that yoke. But if you will be satisfied to enjoy such civil and lawful liberties, such as Christ allows you, then you will quietly and cheerfully submit unto that authority which is set over you in all the administrations of it for your good, wherein if we fail at any time, we hope we shall be willing by God's assistance to hearken to good advice from any of you or in any other way of God. So basically what Winthrop is doing at the end is justifying his right as governor, the right of the magistrates, to basically make independent decisions based on their reading of God's will, even if it contradicts what the people think their elected officials ought to be doing. The implication here, of course, is that if Winthrop believes and is saying that the magistrates and I as governor are obeying the covenant because we only agreed to do the best we could in following God's plan, then his only conclusion is that if we know that to be true, then if the people are complaining that we're not doing what we should be doing, it's because they are operating on natural liberty rather than civil liberty. And the mere fact that they are not supportive of us but are questioning us suggests that we didn't do a good job in teaching them and leading them in the rules and the right way of looking at God's liberty. So what Winthrop is doing here is justifying or legitimizing power of the elected officials to abide by and interpret God's will. What he is basically suggesting here is that the leaders are more capable of knowing God's plan than are the followers. Very, very important concept here, because it's beginning to lead towards and suggest the idea of a division in society between leaders and followers. But the issue that I would leave you with here, we have about 5 minutes to go in our program. The issue that I would leave you here today with is the idea of two kinds of liberty. There's the liberty to do that which is good, just, and honest, the freedom to do what is right, But there's also the idea, if you insist on freedom to do things that we do not agree are right, then that's because you are engaged in what he calls natural liberty. The same kind of liberty that the animals have. We can't, that is totally inconsistent with authority. We can't have that. God's community will not allow that. So therefore, we have the right to say no to you because our position to which you called us gives us the special abilities to know God's will better than you do. So what we're seeing is what happens as a community or a society evolves over 15 years. From Winthrop's first speech on the City Upon a Hill to his second one on liberty, where he is challenging the right of the people to hold him accountable. And he is suggesting, which is key to this whole religious community, the idea that we are called to the offices we serve. And when you are called to an office or to a job, you immediately enter into a covenant with God to be the best at that particular calling or profession that you can be. You enter into an obligation with God to be the best you can be. When I was called as governor, Winthrop is saying, I agreed to do the best I could to interpret and follow God's laws. But you can't hold me accountable because you don't know what they are. Only I do. And so if your freedom leads you to disagree with what I'm doing, it's probably because you're not aware, you're not cognizant of the different kinds of liberties. There's the freedom to do right, but there's also the freedom to do wrong. You do not have that freedom. You do not have the right to question my interpretation of God's plan as the person that you have called to this particular office. So what we're beginning to see is the evolution of political power within the community and the extent to which Winthrop is justifying it in Scripture. But still, it is based on the idea of religious uniformity, the idea of a community. I would suggest to you that there is no way that one can read these documents and not come away with an appreciation and an understanding of the true meaning of community. What we called weeks ago Gemeinschaft. And of course the greatest threat to Gemeinschaft is Gesellschaft, which is the idea of self-interest always taking precedence over the public interest, or over the general welfare. And that's what you must resist. So the fact of the matter is, government must always pursue consensus and community. Government must set out to create it. Government must create the sense of unity. It must build it. Always. Because only when it does can it govern effectively. And so the message is clear that if government wants to remain popular and effective, it must find a way to avoid or dodge the controversial issues which divide people. In 1786 in Virginia, Jefferson and Madison both co-authored the Virginia law, the Virginia law on religious freedom. And what they were basically saying is that we must basically accept the fact that everybody in our society does not interpret God and see his relationship with God. And the only way that government can function and pursue consensus in that kind of an environment is to avoid controversies related to religion. We must keep religion out of the equation. Government does not respond to the divisive stuff, only to the unification, to the stuff that is going to unite, not the stuff that will divide. So I would suggest to you that if government did this, and government spent time addressing the proper issues of what government can effectively do to create community and growth and jobs and health care and education and all these things in our society, but to be inhibited from doing that by these differences of opinion over things like religion and other things, like the right to bear arms and all these other issues that divide us. There's no way in the world that government could get into that issue of guns and come out winning. There's no way. Government's responsibility is to govern. The only way that you can govern is to govern around that issue, because you sure as heck can't take it on. It is 4 p.m. We have reached the end of our second hour today. I want to thank you first for being with us. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the week. The weather is supposed to be absolutely gorgeous, at least here in the East. I hope you have a wonderful week. Please be safe, because we want you back here on the Head On Radio Network and at the Virtual Center. I'm Bill O'Brien. I appreciated so much the opportunity to be with you today. Be safe, and we'll get back together again next Monday. Thank you.